Okay, I believe we're live now. It's good to see
Hey,
you
hey,
guys.
good to see you guys too. Say, something I've run into Florida, putting up curtain rods. I'll put up a curtain rod and I'm running into something behind the drywall and it's not a stud. And of course, it's not a water pipe. But down in Florida, it seems like I've run into a lot of metal, either a metal stud or a strip of metal that they put around the window for. Any of you guys have any experience on that? In new construction, are they putting more metal surrounding like where the windows are, where you would put like or am I barking up the wrong tree here?
I don't know, but I love
Unfortunately,
the
our panel is not about that.
Yeah.
I do love the
I do
placement
feel
of the
it might make a good conversation
Yeah.
for the Daily Answer podcast.
Okay. There you go. There you go.
I
I'll
will
tell
say
you what, I've been doing it kind of cheat style. Like I have curtains here in my office, and I've been using those rods where you just, well, they're like shower curtain rods. They
Yeah. Oh,
expand in and out.
ten- tension rods.
Yeah,
Tension
tension
rods.
rods, and so
Yeah.
they're just kind of stuck up in the windowsill there,
Okay.
and that way I don't have to make any holes or anything like that. So. But
Well,
no, I'm not familiar. It wouldn't surprise me if they're using more metal structures. I mean, that would be my guess.
right.
Obviously, you got
Okay.
Florida, hurricanes, and all that kind of thing. I don't
Right.
know. Do you know how old your house is?
Yeah. 2015, 14,
Okay, so
15, something
yeah.
like that.
2015 years old.
What?
2015 years old.
Yes, 2015 years old. Yes, that's how old it is. It was before Florida was a state. So, but
So Bob would have been around.
yeah, and
Yeah.
I was thinking about there's a number of things, and I'm talking like an old man now, and I'm talking like you ever get a repairman that comes out? Let's say there's a guy under your sink doing something, and from under the sink you hear something like, "Now, why did they do that?" And that
Yep.
yeah, and I'm saying that now. I'm
Hmm.
going up and I'm looking at how stuff was attached, and it's like, well, they didn't mount that properly, and this old man's voice is coming out of me. Now, why did they do that?
is that
And
like
that's
the
never a good sign. The repair's starting off on the right foot,
Uh,
right? Now, why did they do that?
is that the equivalent of a doctor in the middle of a surgery just
oh
saying,
no.
Oh, yeah,
interesting.
Okay, we got to start the show. We'll see in just a minute. That's a good one to end on. Welcome back to Answering Religious Error. We thank you for tuning in on our program tonight. Every Tuesday night, we come to you with Keeping My Head on Straight, a series of lessons to encourage us to, think godly in all the things that we strive to do and make sure that we're looking to things above and not of the things of the earth. And so we encourage you to tune in every Tuesday night to Keeping My Head on Straight right here on your Facebook page or YouTube. And we look forward to hearing your comments on these lessons. Tonight, we're going to be talking about being single as a Christian. Last week, we talked about dating. So we're kind of continuing a trend here in regard to some of the thinking that we might see in society as to whether marriage is a good thing or not. Should we promote it as Christians? Should we put more of our effort and time into godly things? How do we balance all of these things in our lives? So we hope that you'll find encouragement from our study tonight, and then later on after the program we'll tell you about our live Bible Q&A every Wednesday at noon, and then some other programs we have going on throughout the week. So let's go ahead and bring up the panel, and gentlemen, it's good to be with you this evening and looking forward to your wisdom. And I will just go ahead and say that we are all experienced a little bit older in life, and have lived marital lives, and but we have all been single, and we all understand the concept of it. For some of us, it hasn't been too long since we lived the single life, and so we come to it with very varied, varied perspectives. I believe we all have our individual stories on the panel tonight. Mark Dunnigan is with us, Bob Myhan, Stephen McCrary, and Mark Gibson. Thank you all for being with us tonight. So before we begin our study this evening, let's bow our heads in prayer. And Stephen, thank you for joining us this evening. I know we called on you at last notice, but if you will, lead us in prayer.
Absolutely. Let's bow. Lord, we are grateful to you for giving us this time in your mercy and grace you have bestowed upon us. We pray, Lord, that you would guide us, guide our minds, help us to understand each other, to listen to each other, to have a profitable conversation that will be useful for us and for those listening. We recognize, Lord, that you have made so many good things for us. You've made so many good things and done so many good things for humanity. We praise you for that. Help us to give you the glory tonight as we work together and strive to understand this topic together and to consider it together. We ask your blessings upon the sick and the suffering who are on our minds right now. Be with them, give them comfort and strength, especially those who are spiritually sick, Father. Help us to reach out and do what we can for them. Bless the congregations we're a part of, and uh, please just help us to be all that you want us to be in your kingdom. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. And Mark Dunnigan, good being with you. And if you will, start us off in our study.
Well, Chris, great to be on the show. Great to have everybody with us, Bob and Mark and Stephen on late notice. Stephen, tonight you're going to be like Kirk Gibson. Kirk Gibson in that playoff game with the Dodgers and the Athletics years ago, who said, I got one good hit in me. You're going to come off the bench and you're going to send one over the fence. We want to talk about being single tonight. And I think, Chris, we want to start this off with marriage. I mean, is marriage still relevant? Is it an antiquated institution? You know, in Genesis 1:31, God makes everything at the end of the seventh day. And of course, this is kind of an overview in chapter 1. Chapter 2, he goes into more details. But he said, and he saw what he had made, behold, it was very good. And that would include the universe, and that would include all the laws that govern it, and the plants and the trees and the animals, but also that would include Adam and Eve and the institution of marriage. It's very good. In the book of Genesis, verse 18 of chapter 2, it's not good that man is alone, and a man leaves father, mother, and cleaves to his wife. And that institution is created before civil government. That's marriage between a man and a woman, the nuclear family, husband, wife. That's really the foundation of civilization, and I think it still is. And in the New Testament, the equivalent might be Hebrews 13, verse 4. Marriage is to be held in honor among all. And that seems to be the idea, not just in the first century, but for all time, that this is an incredibly honorable relationship, that it is. I tell you what's antiquated. What's antiquated is man's short-sighted alternatives. How about that? Man's short-sighted alternatives are what come and go. But gentlemen, I'd like to hear some of your thoughts on this. We're in a culture, and what and we're hearing some of this, and some young people and some older people who should know better saying this. Marriage, the institution is antiquated. Amazingly, though, a whole lot of people still want to get married. Your thoughts, gentlemen?
Well, I'll just begin by saying that it is the oldest institution known to man. I mean, when God created man and woman, he put them together in marriage. And we see that before our understanding of church but that in a manner of speaking, I'm reminded also of something an older brother once told me. Before God gave man a wife, he gave him a job. So you could say work is the oldest institution, but antiquated. That's interesting because I think what we mean by that statement is in conflict with what people think in modern day society. And so, what do you guys think about that?
Well, my knee jerk reaction sometimes, and this is not always fair, but my knee jerk reaction since high school when I learned that popular music was just something that you just avoid. Look for the obscure stuff in the record store and things like that. Uh, but my knee jerk reaction is to go back to what Jesus said about woe to you when all men speak well of you, Luke 6:26, for so did their fathers to the false prophets. It's very popular to say that marriage is outdated, marriage is antiquated, that there's no need for it anymore. The nuclear family is no more, et cetera, et cetera. And yeah, I think if you look at it generationally, yeah, each generation it seems like less people are getting married, but you also have to think about the moral aspects of it too. We're as societies, we're generally, especially the U.S., we're generally making it easier to not get married. I know that there are a lot of economic benefits to being married, et cetera, tax breaks, whatever. But the reality is, it's much easier for a man to live with a woman outside of marriage, to not have this commitment that keeps him there legally in that way. And he can just leave anytime he wants. And you get all the physical benefits of that relationship. You're playing marriage without really being married. So that is the moral aspect of it. But in the context of what we're talking about tonight, I think it's important that even those who are single don't think lesser of other people's situations. I think that's just the basic idea. We don't want to think, well, marriage is how things used to be. We think about the 50s, the 60s, and that's, two and a half kids, car in the garage kind of thing. But the reality is that there's a reason why this is popular, and it's been pushed by the movies. It's been pushed through the sitcoms to and even back in the day, you had a lot of characters in some shows that just were really scared of getting married, and this the whole and really all that's done is just to write the drama part of it. But my point is that we're being conditioned often to think that this is what everybody thinks. When in reality, that may or may not be true. And I think what's already been mentioned about how God views marriage is enough for us to recognize this is not a bad thing. This is not an antiquated thing. In fact, this is a necessary thing for society. If society is to be, if it were to be exactly as God would want it to be, then the only way that you would have children is through marriage.
No.
But of course, that's not the way it is in reality. In terms of life as it is. But let's not downgrade it. Let's not talk badly about it.
Well,
Well,
that's
yeah.
the thing about, and when we look at antiquated, I just want to remind us that being the oldest institution out there, well, that says something. Companies pride themselves on how long they've been around. God's view of marriage has been around since the beginning of time. That says something. It means that now, however old this earth may be, at least when we look at our society now, we should have learned a few things instead of rejecting what God perfected from the very beginning. So the proper question is marriage a godly institution? It doesn't matter how old it is. I mean, people change their quote unquote family values all the time. That the idea of family values is trying to be redefined. But there are people going forth to say that marriage between a man and a woman is just, well, it's just not right anymore. It's too limiting. And I had a homosexual person once tell me, he says, I don't limit myself to one sex. He made it sound very demeaning to what we would call straight people. And I know this topic isn't necessarily directly related to that, but that's the thinking in our society today. And I heard that statement 30 years ago.
Then why are they fighting to be married? You've got the same sex couples out there, and they're fighting for the right to be married. Why? Is it if it's so outdated, antiquated? Why do they want the right to be married and all that comes with it? Obviously, there is something God has made within us that desires the companionship of not just a group of people, but someone special that we can become one flesh with. I mean, people would say, why is it antiquated? Well, I can have kids without it. I can have companionship without it. I can have happiness without it. Well, I suppose you can in the raw sense of things, but you can never have the type of relationship between a man and a woman, the proper relationship that God intends. And God made that part of us. Now, being single is a choice, and sometimes circumstances come into play here. But I mean, look at Christ and the church in Ephesians 5. Christ and the church is the model of marriage. The idea of subjection, headship, and so forth. It is part of God's creation, both spiritual and physical. And so it's never outdated because it is part of God's creation. And it's part of the makeup that is in the human family. And you can't outdate that. You can't cut that out.
Mark, those are great comments there. I think of, it's interesting. Jesus was asked about divorce, and he goes back to Genesis. And have you not read, he who made them from the beginning made them male and female. And so we still have male and female. Chris, you made a good point. Just because something old doesn't mean it's antiquated. The law of gravity is very old. The laws of thermodynamics are very old, but they're not antiquated. They're very necessary. You guys have made some great points, particularly, I think, I know there's a lot of people that claim, well, I'm not going to serve God, and maybe that's going to catch up to me in the afterlife, but I can ignore marriage and do it my own way and still pretty much have everything in this life. Wrong. You can't. And you're just fooling yourself if you can come up with some other relationship that works just as good or even better. You're going to be proven wrong. You're not going to have the same level of intimacy. You're not going to have the same level of joy. You're not going to have the same level of commitment and trust. Chris, the guy that said, well, I don't limit myself. Wait a minute, you are limited.
Yeah.
You cannot have anybody you want. That's first thing. But second thing, Chris, they kind of give the idea that monogamy is boring, and actually it's not. To be with a woman, to be with a man for the rest of your life, a person who's growing and learning, and you're growing and learning, that never is boring. What's boring is jumping from one person to another. And here's the thing. If you start jumping from one person to another, don't think you're going to be you're going to be landing with someone like, I'm going to find me a real good person. No, guess what? The person you're going to find is the person who's also jumping. It's like two ticks on a dog,
Mm-hmm.
but there's no dog. So that might offend some people, but it's two ticks on a dog. You're both a couple of bloodsuckers is what you are.
And how can you ever really have trust?
Well, yeah. If
there's
it's
always
like
that quote unquote option. People are like, they like to leave out the vow portion of marriage, in their wedding ceremonies today. I'm not going to serve. I'm not going to obey. I'm not going to commit myself. And that's the sad, idea that people have, because they will say in their youth, well, they just didn't know. They felt like they had love, but then they found their soulmate in someone else. I'm like, no, it doesn't work that way. Marriage and seeking marriage there are challenges of being single, and some of them, come down to meeting godly needs as well. For instance, what about lust? We'll talk about that in just a few moments. How do you fulfill the natural desires that God does give you? And naturally, he wants us to be married. He said the bed is undefiled in marriage. One of the problems that comes from staying single in that regard is, well, pornography is a huge issue in our world today. You've got obviously sexual immorality, many partners. People think that's liberating, but there are a whole slew of other problems that go along with that. You have the problem of pedophilia in the world today. There are religions that limit their priests, and everyone knows about this. You hear about it in the news, and because many of them are not allowed to marry, they seek companionship and people they shouldn't be spending time with, and young people are being abused, because of that. So there are just so many doors of sin that are open.
I,
But we do have quite a few questions tonight, so why don't we go through them, and we'll be discussing some of these things as we go along.
Well, Chris, let's bring up that next question there. And as we do, to the audience, all the studies that you'll see out there are husband, wife, kids. That's what brings stability. Uh, you look at the neighborhoods where you don't have husband, wife, and the kids. You look at the neighborhoods, the areas where you just have a lot of single men or unwed single women, and you have crime. That's what you got. So, just give it the eye test. Is it healthy and godly for a woman to claim that she doesn't need a man? And again, let's clarify this question. Again, it's okay to be single, but we're looking at an attitude here. We're looking at an attitude that's different than I'm going to be single. I think of 1 Corinthians chapter 7. I was thinking of this, Chris, that not all forms of singleness are equally valid. Not all forms of singleness are good. That is the motives behind it. 1 Corinthians chapter 7 says, it's interesting where it says that the one who is unmarried is concerned about the things of the Lord. And I think in 1 Corinthians 7, when Paul talks about singleness, I think he's talking about you would use that to serve God. That's what you would use that for. Not I don't need a man and I can do everything on my own. And so I'm going to make a point that I can be independent, buy me a house or whatever. To me, that's a different attitude. And not only that, but I think it's a naive attitude of a woman who says, "Well, I don't need a man." Well, wait a minute. What about the elders of the church? Do you need them? What about Bible class teachers and the evangelists and the deacons? What about the men that serve in the military? And what about the other men in the congregation that maybe help you move or whatever? This idea that I don't need anybody else, man is not non. Man is that unchristian. Stephen, you got a comment?
I've it reminds me. This question reminds me of. I've run into uh, brethren. One brother in particular, I'm thinking of, who told me one time he didn't want his daughters to be dependent upon a man to take care of them. So that's why he was pushing for them to get through high school and get to college, get a degree, and everything. That's great. That's fine. I mean, the woman. It's not an issue there, but I do think that maybe there's some issue with the fathers here, pushing their daughters to be more self-sufficient. I don't know. I want to be careful saying that too, because again, I think that's a good thing. You don't know what's going to happen, and we live in a society where women are easily able to go and to make money and to be able to have jobs. So we don't really have an issue with that. It's not like the first century in that we read about in the scriptures, where if you weren't married, then I mean there were only a few options open to you as far as how to bring in wealth. But I think it's important for us to this is something for us to think about as fathers and as mothers. Is okay, how do we balance this point where we're preparing our daughters enough? And I know this gets a little into parenthood, but we're preparing our daughters enough to make it, but especially we want to make sure they understand their life for Christ is the most important thing. That is the priority.
Absolutely. I think Proverbs 31 is the essence of
Mm.
what you're talking about, Stephen,
Mhm.
because you've got a hardworking woman, an ethical woman, but she also lifts up her husband. But at the very end of the chapter, it concludes by saying, "Here's a woman who fears the Lord." There is no greater thing. Now, if a man wants to raise his little girl to have a good job, make good money, yeah, not a problem in the world with that. There are some that have, I'll just say, antiquated views that, as a man, I'm going to be the breadwinner. My wife's going to stay home, and raise the children and all. It's like, okay, that's I've heard guys with that kind of attitude, and their marriages don't work out very well for the most part. And
Well,
there
I
are
should,
some that work out very fine if a woman has that desire.
yeah.
Let me tell you, raising children is a job. Running a household is a job. Let's not demean that in any way. But there's this difference between providing or teaching them a work ethic versus this idea of independence from, a relationship, with a man in that regard. Money and job are not the issue. Desires, emotions, having children, those are issues. Those are godly issues that must be dealt with. And again, I refer back to Proverbs 31. But Bob had a comment.
Yeah, the motherly instinct is stronger in some women than in others. Uh, but if a woman wants to be a mother, she's got to be a wife first. Children born out of wedlock. There is a name given to that is not a good word that we would want to throw around, but illegitimate, and of course the B word, bastard. No young person wants to be called that by his playmates at school just because his mother was not married when he was born, or even when he was conceived. And so I think there needs to be that consideration there too. Also in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 that Mark referred to, verses 25 and 26, Paul wrote, "Now concerning virgins, I have no commandment from the Lord, yet I give judgment as one whom the Lord in his mercy has made trustworthy. I suppose, therefore, that it is good because of the present distress, that it is good for a man to remain as he is." And he says similar things about the woman. And as Mark pointed out, the single man, the single woman, they can spend more time involved in the work of the Lord, spiritual labors, and yet that is not the ideal situation. Uh, I don't know what this present distress is. I've never read a commentator who claimed to know what that present distress was, but there was something that was making it particularly difficult for married couples. But back in chapter one, or early, not chapter one, but early here in chapter 7, he had said in verse 2, "Nevertheless, because of sexual immorality, let each man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband." We're going to have these fleshly desires, these physical desires, and we're going to be affected by people around us. Men cannot help but be affected to some extent by the women around them, and the same with the women by the men around them, uh, and we've all got to practice self-control, self-discipline, and it is so much easier when one is in a scriptural marriage. If one is not eligible for a scriptural marriage, then of course he's got a tougher road to hoe. But he's got a moral standard that he's got to live up to. And if you want to go to heaven, then there's nothing God wants you to do that you're not willing to do if you really want to go to heaven. And I believe that there's no such thing really as a committed relationship, even heterosexual relationship, that does not include marriage. If they're not committed enough to marry, then that's not really commitment. That's just I'll be there as long as I want to. I'll love you as long as I love you,
Yeah.
and then I'll be on my way.
It's kind of a selfish view that a lot of people have. I'll love you. I'll stick with you as long as it's good for me.
Yeah,
And then as soon as my feelings or some circumstances change, they want out of it or they want something different. It's a very selfish notion to have. And then,
Yeah.
of course, who are the victims in this, especially when children are involved? They grow up looking at a home, that's divided in various ways. And what kind of marriages are they going to have in those days? And I've seen, too many marriages that maybe ended in divorce, produce children whose marriages end in the same way. And they just don't know how to keep it together because they haven't been given the right example because the mother and father didn't do justice. And people try to normalize that today, and you just can't. Any other thoughts before we go on to the next question?
Yeah, Chris, it's one of those things. It's if you're wanting to leave the back door open, if you want an exit strategy, it's not going to work. Marriage is all or nothing. You're all in. That is, you enter that marriage. You enter that marriage saying what the vow says. That is, I'm going to make this work, no matter what. I'm going to make this work till death. And any sort of like, well, if this or if this or if this, no, that's not the commitment. That's not leave and cleave. Leave and cleave is I'm all in. It's the same sort of all in of becoming a Christian to the death, to the death. I am all in. You guys had some great comments there on that particular question. You know, 1 Timothy 5:14 says, I want younger widows to get married. And I wanted to talk a little bit, Chris. I appreciate, I think, Stephen, you bringing up the gentleman that says, you know, I want to make sure my daughters get a good education so they're not dependent on some man, or like maybe if they don't find a man, they can still support themselves, or maybe they find a man, he leaves them, you know, they're not on welfare or whatever. And I understand that. But I also understand that's a this world thinking. That's a this that is there's even something more important than her career or whatever. That is that she's a godly woman. Not only that, but I think I see kind of a danger here, Chris. With some of that is that if men have such a good job, they don't need a woman, and if women have such a good job, they don't need a man. Then are we shooting ourselves in the foot as a people, or should it surprise us that people may be like, hey, I can support myself on my own, and marrying somebody means that I got to split my money with them and decisions, and my time is not on my time. You know what I mean? Is that, I know it seems like that can be a double-edged sword, that we need to be careful about that. I come from a generation of I'm dependent on other people. I pull my own weight, but I don't know if I'm going to make it to heaven without someone helping me. You know what I mean? Like, and so at the end of the day, with that sort of thinking, okay, daughter has a great job, okay, but she's single, okay, but sometimes in those cases, if I don't have a helpmeet, am I going to make it to heaven? So I don't know. Those are just some other thoughts I have that surround that particular question. Yeah, I mean, I think a woman should be as, skilled or educated as she should be, but I don't know. I think there's a danger there in that as well. There's a danger that we become so self-sufficient
Well,
that we
God
don't
from the
need
very
anybody
beginning,
else.
yeah, God from the very beginning said it's not good for man to be alone. Now, we could probably give you a whole list of reasons as to why it's not good for man to be alone, but you already said the word. I will make a help meet for him, a companion for him. And we all need companionship to a certain extent. And
Well,
it
yeah.
fulfills many of the various roles. And, is it healthy and godly for a woman to claim that she doesn't need a man? Not in the worldly sense today.
Mhm.
Now, if you are of a character of that type of selfishness, where what's mine is mine and mine is mine, then yeah, obviously you can't share a life with someone. And that happens all too often where people don't make themselves compatible. There is a give and take. And I know we're not talking necessarily about marriage tonight, but if you're going to talk about being single, you have to learn what the expectations are. Some people remain single for so long that they get to a point in life they don't know how to share anymore. They don't know how to, express that kind of love. But anyway, our next question deals with much the same, kind of thinking, but from a man's perspective. We want to go ahead and bring that up. Uh,
Absolutely. What do we got
you know,
there? Okay. Yeah, and here's the man. I don't want to commit. I really see that. I see this as a danger equally of maybe for the woman, the temptation is got my career, and so I can prove to people out there I'm independent. I don't need anybody. Look what I bought this house myself. Whatever. Okay. I think though men at times are tempted by, hey, I want to play the field, and I want to keep my options open, and not only that, but uh, man, marriage takes a lot of work, and you got to share, and you got to compromise, and cherish and love and cherish and all of that stuff, and there's sacrifice involved. Um, and you know, Chris, the interesting thing about this is the men that go down this road are losing. You don't gain anything by going down this road. You lose. I tell you what, Chris, I've seen a lot of men over the years that play the field, okay, and they keep playing the field. But as time goes on, okay, as time goes on, the women that the selection narrows, okay. And the quality of the team, kind of like, and the girlfriends get a little bit more scarier each one. What's the name for that? A little bit more wear and tear, a little bit more wear and tear as time goes on. Mark, you're on the show tonight. Mark, you have any comments on this question?
Well, it doesn't matter what the circumstance is. Healthy and godly and avoiding commitment doesn't equal up. That's not going to work. It's not healthy and godly to avoid commitment. I mean, any sane male is going to make a commitment as to what he's going to be when he goes through school, what kind of learning, what kind of life he's going to commit himself to. He does that. In his job, he's going to commit himself to a job. He'll look for a job. He'll get accepted. He'll say, good, I've got a job, and he'll work hard at it. He makes a commitment to that. The greatest commitment of all is our commitment to God. And a Christian man will be making his commitments to God. And the Bible says in Proverbs 8:22, he who finds a wife finds a good thing. Now there's something to commit to. We want to commit to good things in life, and finding a wife is a good thing. And so it is healthy and godly for a man to seek to be committed to a godly woman. If he so chooses, it will certainly aid him in life. And so that's my thoughts on the matter.
Well, and
I
I'd
know,
like
Mark.
to, just
Yeah.
kind of use the old disclaimer kind of argument as well, just to remind folks that we're talking about people that have that ability to do so. They have the right, to seek a wife. And there are many that unfortunately are in a position where perhaps they cannot. Maybe it's due to an unscriptural, breakup in a marriage, and then various other things. But we remember that the Lord said some have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom. And I think that has various definitions as well as the physical definition, but also in the fact that some have kept themselves, for the purpose. We look at Paul the apostle. A lot of people will go to him as an example to say, here's a guy that wasn't married, but he preached the most about marriage. And why? Because he had divine inspiration and authority to do so. So how could he practically know? I was told before I had children that when I taught children's classes, I was actually told by Christian people, well, you don't really understand because you don't have children. Well, it was nice to know that after I had children, when I started, learning the perspective they expected me to have, I found the Bible taught exactly the same thing. Now, yes, you learn different perspective, but it didn't change the rules of God's commands as to how to be married and how to, but it helps you to be more understanding. It does give you perspective, but does it change God's will? And what I'm trying to say here is the fact that if you are able to, then you should. We should apply ourselves to doing God's will within the confines of what God has allowed us to do. And again, it avoids a lot of other issues and problems along the way as well.
What do you got, Stephen?
You might as well say that you've not committed adultery. You don't have any business preaching against that.
Oh yeah. Well, it's kind of like Alcoholics Anonymous, and I'm not criticizing the program at all. I have visited meetings to encourage people. I've never had that problem myself, but I was able to get perspective and I saw where people were to be encouraged by other people that had the same problems than they did. But I also wanted to encourage people to say, look, go to people that haven't done this as well. You can learn from them. Go to somebody that hasn't, committed these things and get their perspective and ask people, how did you do it? When you want to have a good, healthy marriage, Go to a couple that's been married for 50 years and say, "Hey, how'd you do it?" And they're going to tell you they struggled, they had problems along the way. I've had elders and preachers tell me if it weren't for God in their lives, they might be divorced today. God gives the plan for his people to stay together, because if we live worldly, then we're going to have a worldly reason to tear ourselves apart.
Chris, I appreciate you bringing up Matthew 19, because that is what you're doing. You know, when you're a faithful Christian and you decide to be single, you're choosing a life of celibacy. I mean, that literally is it. Because if you're not choosing a life of celibacy, then you're not going to be a faithful Christian.
Yeah, it comes with
Uh,
restrictions.
and so there, but here's something that just really occurs to me. I have known uh, women older than me who have spent their whole life single, never married, and they're wonderful, godly ladies. And truly, truly, from the bottom of my heart, appreciate them. I'll tell you, I've never heard them speak disparagingly of men. I've never heard them speak disparagingly of marriage. I've never heard them talk down about their elders or their preacher or anything like that. Uh, so that's the example, right? And so whether you're a man or a woman, it's healthy and godly to remain single for the sake of the kingdom. If that's where your best place is, then you do it, but you commit to it. And it does occur to me as well, and I welcome y'all's thoughts on this as well. I don't think I've seen very many single men who have been single all their lives, and men that I would call godly men. They're out there, and I've met them. Don't get me wrong, but I'm just saying I've probably seen more women than men who are committed, godly Christians who have never married.
I've seen that too by a certain ratio. And that brings up another thought in my mind. And I've seen this, primarily in, well, it's here in the United States, but also it's a problem among some Christians in other countries where men have not made that commitment to one woman. And I think we call it the difference between being monogamous, I guess is the fancy word to use. And, without monogamy, what eventually happens is a man jumps from woman to woman to woman. And next thing you know, he's got 10 children from 10 different women. That's a thing. That's happening in our world today. And it's not right. It's just not right. And that's one of the problems that comes from this when you don't choose God's plan of committing yourself to one individual. And what are some other thoughts? We have a few other questions to
You know,
cover, and really our next one kind of deals with that issue of lust.
I just want to say when a person has been through multiple marriages and divorces and divorce again, it is so sad when they have to divide up the children and say, okay, which two are
Mhm.
yours again?
Right.
Which two are mine?
Yeah,
Uh, that's just so sad that
it is.
uh, you know every kid is a step kid as well as a child of one of the parents.
And I'll just say the old classic phrase, every child needs a father, every child needs a mother. And I know that's not always going to happen. I mean, we have in our world, we have death. We lose our loved ones. There are circumstances that we are put into, but when we have the choice, and we should live to that extent, what's best, not only for me, but what's best for the children, what's best for my family, and for society around me. Let's look at the next question because it probably hits home in a little bit more of a practical way in regard to what some single people might deal with. Mark?
Yeah, it's how do you deal with your lusts, and of course this would be there's all sorts of desires, but this would be in the sexual area. Is it fair for God to give us a desire that we can't lawfully fulfill at the moment? And Chris, there's a passage in James chapter 1 that I thought was helpful in this area. Let no one say when he's tempted, I'm being tempted by God. But then it says, each one is tempted when he's carried away and enticed by his own lust. And, we're all built, we're all designed with desires. We're all given wholesome desires at birth. We come into this world pure and innocent. 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 20. And my thought to any young people out there or older people out there that struggle in this area would be that if you're tempted by doing something sexually unlawful, you've created that. You got to own that. God gave you natural desires, but God did not give you any corrupt desires. God did not give you any rebellious desires. God gave you good desires that can be used lawfully. And that would be one thing there, that if you're off, and this would be with the previous comment, Chris, that Stephen said, a eunuch for the kingdom. You keep yourself a eunuch for the kingdom. It's not, I want to be single, have my own place, and have my virtual girlfriend, and I'm single. No, that's not a eunuch for the kingdom. But that's what a lot of people are doing, and I think pretending. You can't put that on God. You can't blame God for the temptation of pornography. You can't blame God for that. You created that, you fed that, and you can't say, but I've always been that way. Wait a minute, you don't know how you've always been. I can't remember past 4 years old. I don't know how I've always been. Not only that, but even your memory of what you were like at 6, 8, 9, and 10 is not accurate at times. So this idea, well, I've always been this way or always had this particular desire. If it's unlawful, no, you have not always had that particular desire. You're not remembering the past correctly. But gentlemen, I would like to hear what you have to say on this particular one. I like 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. Each man know how to possess his own vessel in sanctification and honor. So this is not one of those things like, well, it can't be done. All right. This is very doable. But let me see what we got here.
In 1 Corinthians 10:13, the Apostle Paul wrote, "No temptation has overtaken you except such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted above or beyond what you are able, but will with the temptation make also the way of escape, that you may be able to bear it." But we've got to look for that way of escape. And the way to escape temptation is to go to God in prayer before we sin. So many times people think of prayer as simply asking forgiveness for sins that they have committed. And certainly we do need to ask forgiveness for sins we have committed. But the more we ask for strength to endure temptation, the less frequently we will have to ask for forgiveness.
You know, some of the churches that Paul wrote to, they would have these pagan societies and there would be these temple prostitutes. Can you imagine being a Christian in the first century and you're walking on your way home from work in the evening and you pass by the temple of Diana or, whatever, and you see a woman there and you know what she's there for. And you know that this is not going to, not going to be an issue. I could pop in and pop out. It won't have to mean anything, quote unquote. And I think we have to remember that is just as, obviously we talk about pornography and how immediate that gratification is, but I think that was just as legitimate a temptation, if not worse. I mean, think about, again, we don't really have to deal with that particularly, at least in our societies in the U.S. So I'm not having to drive by that necessarily. But we need to keep in mind that these commands meant something back then. And when they're saying, when Paul is saying, you flee lust and pursue righteousness, obviously that includes more than just the sexual lust, but it just means you got to keep yourself busy. Paul also says, if you're burning with lust, then yeah, you should probably marry. I think a lot of times people who are single will lean hard on what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 7 and other places to kind of say, well, he's saying marriage is not necessary. He wishes everyone was like him. It's interesting, by the way, when you look into it, if Paul was a member of the Sanhedrin, it's very likely he had been married. There's a thought out there, and I don't have scripture for this, but it's sort of interesting to note, if he was a member of the Sanhedrin, if he was married, then it's possible that his wife left him when he became a Christian. I don't know that for sure, but regardless, Paul lived a life, I think we can see, where he disciplined himself. And that's what you're choosing when you're choosing the single life. You have to discipline yourself. Again, I've known men to I have known younger fellas to specifically choose that. And I say, okay, you commit to it. I mean, you go with it. And I've admired the way I've seen it lived out sometimes. But one in particular got married a few years ago too. So, and that's been a great blessing to him. So we got to keep in mind that the whole point is for us to glorify God, not blame Him for these problems. We have to be the ones that are working on this to avoid sinning against Him.
We have a comment here, and I think it's valid to point out. Here's an individual that says, "I'm one of those people that have no desire or need to get married," and Becky's been following us for quite a while on our studies, and seems to have very godly intentions in her life. And here's a person that when we don't know each other, certainly, but we would just encourage you, when, if those temptations of life do get in the way, God, gives a way, through those things. But if you don't have a desire or the need, certainly you know that of yourself. And we want to make it clear, it's not it's not a sin by any means to not get married or have a desire. As Stephen's already pointed out, there are many faithful people to God, that do not have that kind of relationship. But again, don't let yourself get to the point in life to where you think you'll just always be that way and you'll never have that need. You never know when you just might meet that, special someone or whatever, and those circumstances will change. But do so in a godly way and seek. And if you're giving yourself time, especially as you get older in life, seek a godly person. That if that opportunity ever does come along, make sure that they have the right and the same goals as you do, because we do have human desires, and we do have to know how to overcome our lusts. And here's a question that asks, is it fair for God to give us a desire that we can't lawfully fulfill at the moment? Well, yeah, everything God does is fair, because He teaches us how to overcome and how to put our attention on godly things. I always look at, Second Peter chapter 1 as an example, that if we do these things, verses 10, 11, if we do these things, we will never stumble. And that's adding to our faith and putting our focus on our relationship with God. And it's easier as you get older, because the temptations of youth, do kind of pass you by. But you must, well, we have to apply ourselves and say, okay, if I'm not going to have this goal in life, I need to have another goal, and always make sure I do everything in a godly way.
You
We
know,
only have time for, go ahead, Bob.
there's one young lady I've known nearly all her life since she was about 4 or 5 years old, and she is now in her late 40s, I imagine. And she posted on Facebook just a few months ago that she had done something that weekend she had never done before, and then she said, "I got married." And I'm confident that she had not been married before. I'm sure. Well, she said that she had never gotten it done, had never done it, and I had heard that she was not married for years and years. But I know she's a preacher's daughter. Her parents were godly people, and her mother died several years ago. Her brother, older brother, predeceased her. Uh, and my thinking is wanting to give her the benefit of the doubt that she had simply not married a man that she felt like she could trust to be the one to help her get to heaven. And when she met that man, she made the commitment to marry him.
All right. We are really running out of time. So I'll go ahead and bring up this next question here that deals with kind of the opposite side of, I don't think it's necessarily a wrong attitude to have, but what do you guys think of this? Go ahead, Mark. Give us your intro on this.
Well, this is an interesting one. I, to the people single out there, I think sometimes the thought is if I could just find someone that would somehow bring my life all together. And there's an element of that, I think, especially when you're young, for me when I just become a Christian, and marriage really helped, I think, solidify things. But I think, Chris, there's a danger of thinking, for example, Chris, a person might say, if I could just get married, that would take care of my lust problem. No, you can still have a lust problem in marriage. And I guess I want people to understand that in the marriage, you're still going to be you. Now, hopefully it will help you and you'll mature and develop and things like that. But marriage is not an instant fix from weak Christian to strong Christian, from Christian addicted to pornography to a Christian who's not. Marriage doesn't fix that. And I think there's a danger also of thinking like delaying your happiness or delaying your effectiveness. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, Paul pointed out, hey, whether you're circumcised or uncircumcised, or whether you're married or not married, or a slave or free, that really doesn't matter concerning whether or not how faithful you can be as a Christian. I think marriage is an amazing thing. I don't think I would be the person I am today without marriage. But man, be careful that you don't view it as, if I could just find the right person that would fix everything about me. You're still going to have to work. You're still going to have to put in the effort. And those are kind of my thoughts, but I'd like to hear some other thoughts as well.
Nobody can fix you but you, and you can't do it without God's help. And He'll give you all the help you need with His Word.
And it could complicate things too. I mean, marriage is a big task, and you find yourself dealing with things you never really understood or anticipated. So that has to be noted. Also, the fact is, I think I lost my thought, but I'll get it back in just a moment. Somebody else take it.
Oh, Mark, you made a great point of as far as we don't want to scare people off, but you're right, is that it can, you have now, you've married some parents in a sense. You have now in-laws, and you have relatives, and you have the challenges of your spouse's family. Not only that, but there is a sense that all of a sudden where you're with another person and you are, well, not only physically naked before them, but you're naked before them. And they see who you are, and you have another set of eyes on you, and all of a sudden you're getting some feedback. You're probably getting the most honest assessment that anyone's ever given of you. And that can be uncomfortable. Now, I think you need that. I think you really need that. But just I think it was Jordan Peterson that said that marriage is where you handcuff yourself to another. You're a man and you handcuff yourself to a woman, and then you have to tell each other the truth about yourselves, and you can't run. And I think that on a certain level, that's a pretty honest assessment of the marriage relationship. It may be the first time in your life that you really see the real you, and it's not all going to be pretty. But the good news is, as Bob said, you can fix that with God. Other thoughts?
I remember the first time my wife and I had a lot of, big struggle or something, and she just kind of piped up and said, I'm not going to leave you, And I was like, oh, good. Because, it was a comfort, and it was a help in all that. I think that good women make good men great. I think there are so many good things that you get out of marriage, but that's not guaranteed. Don't marry that boy that you kind of like that has a lot of problems, and you say, well, I can just fix him. Don't marry him. Don't marry the girl that maybe clings to you too much and doesn't think enough for herself. And that again, I try to sound wise here. I'm not. But my whole point is that keep the reality in mind. Keep in mind who you need to be. That's your goal. And then if you're in that place, then you have room to help someone else and to be a part of their life in that way. I'll stop right there.
Yeah,
Well,
Stephen, I think that's a good thought from the standpoint. You got to think long term of, if I live 50, 60 more years, 70 more years, and everything that's going to be thrown at me and everything that's coming down the pike, is this person going to crumble next to me? Can I lean on them? Can I lean on them? I'm going to marry someone that's going to help me bury my parents, raise teenagers, uh, deal with family issues, nurse me if I get cancer or whatever, take care of me, prepare me for death, and help me make it to heaven. And I think all of a sudden it's like, okay, I'm looking for a real quality. It's kind of like I got in the van, took off across America. I want a set of Michelins. Okay. I'm not buying a set of cheap tires. I think the same thing was at marriage. I'm wanting book, chapter, and verse girl. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, a lot of good thoughts. There's a lot of different directions we could take a conversation like this tonight, but we are out of time. There's just not enough time, is there? But you guys have brought a lot of good points, and hopefully, this has been an encouragement to some of you single Christians that are out there. And whatever your desires might be for the future, again, we just admonish you to do them in a godly way. Any last thoughts before we close out our program, gentlemen?
You guys, thanks for all being here tonight. I know you have all busy schedules. You got a lot going on, and the audience doesn't know the half of all the things that you're up against. And thanks for taking the time out of your schedule to be on the show. And I checked my internet speed tonight, and it said it was blazing fast. There you go, blazing fast. That's what I'm looking for.
Yeah, I mean, we love it when you're on the road, but there's something to be said for having some stable internet and a place that you can just, go to every week. I tell you, I don't know if I could do this show if I didn't have the coziness of my little space here to be able to come. And that's another thing that if you want to talk about marriage, just when you get settled in and, with somebody and you're able to kind of grow old together and, it just, there are so many advantages, but have the same attitude when you are striving to be single, of the fact that you can have a good life, you can have a good life with the Lord. And many of our brethren know that. And we've been given some good examples of those tonight. So we'd like to encourage you, pray with you. If you'd like our advice on anything a little bit more detailed in particular, we'd be happy to talk to you about these things. And we'd love to hear from you. Some who've expressed already, they're single. That's a choice they made. Give us some of your insights as well. And, it might be something we can use in a future program. Well, guys, it's good to be with you tonight. And I know some of you will be on the question and answer program tomorrow. So looking forward to that. Have a wonderful evening, and we'll speak to you later. But we want to encourage all of you, as I said, to tune into our Wednesday afternoon program. It starts at 12 noon Eastern Standard Time, and that is the live Bible Q&A. That is kind of, you might say, answering religious errors, premier show. We take your questions, and they just have several questions that they just knock off throughout the hour, and you're going to hear a lot of good quick answers and meditations upon questions that you might have. If you want to send those in to questions@answeringreligiouserror.com, that's the best way to reach them. If you want to comment on programs like this, that's fine, but it's just best if you email those questions, and that way Brian can get them and add them to the lineup as well. So tune in for that every Wednesday at 12 Eastern Standard Time. We also want to encourage you to start your week with Bob's Bible Basics. That's our own Bob Myhan. He brings his program every Monday night at 8 p.m. And then on Thursdays, there's the Older Women Likewise program, and that's at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Both those programs air on Facebook as well as YouTube. So take the opportunity to hear those. You get pretty much something for almost every day of the week, but especially Monday through Friday, we want to encourage you to start your day with the Daily Answer podcast. And that's Mark Dunnigan. He is sharing with us so much about his life, his knowledge, his travels, but most importantly, God's Word in about a 15 to 20-minute program that you can hear beginning at 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time each weekday. Listen to it while you're getting ready for work. Listen to it while you're driving down the road. listen to it again in the afternoon. Just go to your favorite podcast platform and ask it to play the Daily Answer podcast. And you can do the same thing with any of the Answering Religious Error programs. For instance, this program will shortly be in a podcast format shortly after we close out tonight. So you can go back and review some of the things that we've talked about as well. So we thank you for tuning in this evening, and we hope to see you next time. Again, tune in tomorrow for the question and answer session, but we hope to see you next week on Keeping My Head on Straight. And until then, we'll see you on Answering Religious Error.